everybody. Thanks for being here again, and especially Dr. Spruce, thank you for all of your assistance on this. I'm sure you all know I'm Joan Sheffers, and today I'm presenting my senior thesis on whether the states have a legitimate interest in prohibiting physician-assisted suicide in their jurisdictions. Let me see if I need to put this down somewhere, so.
Would you like us to move this over?
Yeah, maybe I will. All right. Okay, well, to start, I'm going to begin with a kind of anecdotal story about physician-assisted suicide to kind of put it in the human perspective. So upon the enactment of the 1997 Oregon Death with Dignity Act, a woman named Helen, who had been diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer and who was living in hospice at the time, became the first person to legally choose physician-assisted suicide in the United States. So various kinds of end-of-life options, PAS, is defined as, physician-assisted suicide, often referred to as PAS, is, quote, the act in which a person is prescribed by a physician a lethal overdose that they will ingest at some time in the future to end their life. So this would be different from euthanasia in that the doctor is not giving you the lethal dose, you actually take it home with you and take it when you decide you want it. So an account of Helen's case, the first one, has been gathered from the information disclosed by the prescribing doctor, Dr. Peter Reagan. And I quote, Reagan was impressed by Helen's determination to die. In an interview with Oregon Public Broadcasting, he described talking to her as like talking to a locomotive in her desire for death, even though she was not in great immediate distress. Although Reagan was troubled by her haste, he was unable to resist it. Reagan subsequently wrote an article for the British journal Lancet in which he stated that he liked Helen immediately, quote, the thought of Helen dying so soon was almost too much to bear. On the other hand, I found even worse the thought of disappointing the family. If I backed out, they'd feel that about me the way they had about their previous doctor, that I had strung them along and in a way insulted them. So clearly there are a lot of interesting things to analyze about this quote, but one thing is for sure, it was the first, but not the last time, someone legally chose physician-assisted suicide in the United States. So, to introduce again the subject, the U.S. underwent a massive and rapid change in its attitude towards physician-assisted suicide during the 20th century, and many are left to wonder kind of what happened. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? What are the risks? What are the benefits? And so in order to engage these questions and hopefully come to some answers about them, I will be doing the following things. 1, giving a historical background of PAS in the United States. 2, giving an analysis of the philosophical foundations of PAS. And lastly, articulating the argument for contemporary PAS in the United States and offering some rebuttals for why the argument against it. So the argument, and I'll just state it now so you can keep it in mind, for PAS is that it needs a foundation in a quality of life philosophy and an understanding of PAS itself as a substantive due process right to personal autonomy and end-of-life options. And this means that the state would have no right to prohibit it if it's a substantive due process right. So again, once I've gone through this argument, I will offer some rebuttals. And then just to give you my thesis statement, the conclusion after all of this, I will make the argument that even if one accepts a quality of life outlook with its associated problems, the legalization of PAS cannot be justified as a substantive due process right to personal autonomy and end-of-life options, because the benefits of doing so do not outweigh the risks posed to the protection and preservation of life and society. So, the historical overview. In the ancient world, views on suicide or suicide varied. Some thought it cowardly, honorable, whatever. But after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, the Christian dominant view established that it was a moral wrong, and this lasted until modernity, essentially. The Christian view sees man as made in the image and likeness of God. He has the responsibility to follow divine and natural laws. And there's an idea of redemptive suffering, so all of this kind of combined to say that you can't do suicide, and assisted suicide is murder. All of this meant that suicide was seen as a disordered act of despair and self-destruction. laws went nearly unchallenged until the 20th century. Sorry, actually, I should mention, this is also the case for the Anglo-American common law tradition. So in our legal tradition, which we have adopted in the United States, suicide was forbidden as far back as 673 at the Council of Hereford. So again, these laws went nearly unchallenged until the 20th century, at which point modernity kind of caught up with the laws and the sentiments in the United States. Modern and postmodern thought rocked the Judeo-Christian foundations that the prohibition of suicide were based on, and they allowed for these new philosophies to spring up, which could allow it. And so these philosophies, which I'm about to get into in the philosophical review, were a quality of life philosophy, primarily, and most foundationally, but secondarily, as a justification for it, an understanding of man as being primarily an autonomous, rights-bearing individual, most especially as articulated by John Locke. That's also very important for the contemporary argument for PAS in the United States. So, let's see, I'll go on to the philosophical foundation. So like I said, the most fundamental foundation is the quality of life outlook. You can have autonomy, the second philosophical foundation, and not really support PAS, but you can't really be in favor of or hold a quality of life outlook without at least usually hoping or working to have PAS decriminalized in some way. So what I'm trying to say is that quality of life is more foundational. So what is quality of life? We can start with its counterpart, actually, the Sanctity of Life Foundation, which is what we had held, and I imagine a lot of us hold here at Ave Maria. This is that all life is sacred, regardless of one's physical or mental state. Life has inherent value, regardless of the condition in which one lives. As such, innocent life may never be taken, whether it be by another person or by oneself. So, in the context of the PAS debate, this means that those who hold the Sanctity of Life view do not support PAS. So the Sanctity of Life view, historically held in the West, is also responsible for our long tradition of prohibiting it. The quality of life view, however, is one in which life's value is dependent on the degree to which life has certain necessary qualities. These would be sentience, self-awareness, autonomy, and really, I feel most people today would just say enjoyment or like joy in life. So this is naturally the foundation of PAS, because if you don't have these, then you want the option to have control of your death, the right to die, as they say. Where did this quality of life view come from, and I'm going to offer some inherent dangers in it. Well, it was only introduced into the United States really, or only became popular in the 20th century, which again is the time when our opinions began to change on this. The two problems that I find with it that are inherent in it are that there's a slippery slope. There's no set standard for what makes life worth living. You can say that life's only not worth living if you have no control at all, you're mentally impaired, your personality, maybe you're dangerous, I don't know. That's one of the more sympathetic arguments, but some, like those who looked past sterilization laws in the 20th century, thought that life wasn't worth living if you this was based on some pseudoscientific idea about some different qualities, but that if you were a criminal, if you had any disabilities, that would make life not worth living. That's kind of the opposite side of the spectrum. So that would be the first inherent danger. The second one would be that if one accepts quality of life, you accept that it's the body that is offending. It's not a matter of autonomy, it's the body. So you can see this, a big problem, not really in the United States right now, but in the Netherlands, for example, in which doctors will take it upon themselves to eliminate someone's suffering because they don't have the qualities of life that make it enjoyable anymore. So those are two of the inherent dangers. And then just lastly, to wrap up the philosophical analysis or undertones or what may have you of physician-assisted suicide is an acknowledgement that Locke and the idea of autonomy is also important to this. The notion of man as an autonomous individual who is capable of self-governance was articulated by Locke and is also very important. This notion is taken up by those who hold the quality of life view and use it to justify legalizing it as a substantive due process right. So given all this, what's the contemporary argument for PAS? Well, as I said at the beginning, it's given a quality of life viewpoint. PAS is a substantive due process right to personal autonomy in end-of-life decisions. So they claim that it is, as substantive due process was articulated in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, it is central to the dignity and autonomy of a person. And that's what their argument is, at which case the state has no right to limit it because it's a natural right. So anyways, a good example of this argument in the law is Oregon's 1997 Death with Dignity Act. Some of the restrictions that they had were that the person must be 18 years of age or older. They must be capable of making and communicating healthcare decisions for themselves. So this reflects the autonomous side of it. Furthermore, the lethal dose must be self-administered. That's again the autonomous side of it. The quality of life side of it, you need to be diagnosed with a terminal illness that will lead to death within 6 months, and the attending physician is gonna decide if all of those things are met. So I won't get into the physician side of this because I don't have enough room in the scope of my thesis, but anyways, this argument has been very successful in America. There are, I believe, 7 states now that have legalized PAS, and they all use this foundation, and they all have modeled their laws after Oregon's. So now I'm going to offer some rebuttals to this argument. The first part of the argument about the quality of life, I'm just going to give some, it's not like the turning point in my argument, but it undermines it, and I think that's important later for my conclusion, which is that the dangers of codifying quality of life ideas is that you will endanger life and the protection of life in society, especially those of people with disabilities. You can kind of like create an idea of them that is not healthy by doing this. The second part of it, about it being a substantive due process right, my rebuttal to that is that this is not compatible with the most basic views of American society, and it does not, so that's the first one. It's not compatible with it, and the state has a right to protect life, which is in conflict with this idea of it being a substantive due process right. And secondly, which is part of this first one, legalizing PS does not actually promote autonomous decision making. And I'll make those arguments as they come. So the first rebuttal is that the dangers of accepting quality of life in the law are that I lost my place. So the dangers of doing this are that, one, the reasons for requesting PAS since legalization of it in Oregon in 1997 are contrary to the well-being of the most vulnerable people in our community, and two, the idea that suicide is a good option, which is also something that the American values do not hold. So I'm going to give this in the example of the 3 top reasons for requesting PAS in the United States. These were 1, loss of autonomy, 2, decreasing ability to participate in activities that made life enjoyable. These are the top 3 reasons that people requested it. 90% of people said that this was a reason to request it. And thirdly, loss of dignity. 66 people claim this. Another one that I will be covering briefly is a fear of being a burden. Right now, 63% of people noted that as a reason that they wanted to request PAS. As I said, these have troubling implications for how we as a society look and treat our most vulnerable. So loss of autonomy and decreasing ability to participate in activities that make life enjoyable both have to do with personal autonomy and the loss of it. So, and this could be defined as the capacity, quote, the capacity to decide for oneself and pursue a course of action in one's life. So accepting this as a good reason is troublesome because it implies that for those who have serious medical conditions with no hope of recovery, suicide is a good option. Obviously this applies to people with disabilities, chronic illnesses, people with treatment-resistant psychological disorders, and furthermore, to accept and affirm that loss of personal autonomy makes life not worth living. It gives the idea that value in life comes from one's independence and usefulness, which we don't want to espouse. The third most popular reason, loss of dignity, is tied to a study that was done, showed that it was tied to a hopelessness, depression, and intimate dependency factors found in terminal illnesses. Again, these are clearly things experienced by people with disabilities, and that's an issue. And then lastly, the fear of being a burden is becoming increasingly more common. In one of the most publicized cases of PAS since legalization, that of 29-year-old Brittany Maynard, the young woman described her fear of being a burden as one of the most important factors in her decision to request PAS. And I quote, I probably would have suffered in hospice care for weeks or even months, and my family would have had to watch that. I did not want this nightmare scenario for my family, so I started researching death with dignity. So again, who is hurt the most by all these things? The vulnerable communities. Loss of autonomy is widely understood that it is unacceptable and dangerous to the preservation of life in society to tell someone, for example, with multiple sclerosis or cerebral palsy, that essentially their life is not worth living. That's obviously an unacceptable thing to do, and even like abusive if you look at it in certain situations. Loss of dignity. As the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund published in their statement opposing the legalization of PAS, quote, as many thousands of people with disabilities who rely on personal assistance have learned, needing help is not undignified, and death is not better than reliance on assistance. Have we gotten to the point that we will abet suicides because people need help using the toilet? Unquote. So, all of these three reasons have serious implications for our vulnerable members of society, accepting them and codifying these as acceptable reasons to kill yourself, essentially. The last part would be that accepting suicide as an answer to these problems is also a serious danger to those who are just suffering from psychological disorders and depression and are tempted to commit suicide. It has been shown that in Oregon, there was an increased rate of other suicides after the legalization of physician-assisted suicide. So in short, a culture that accepts and legalizes PAS as a solution to loss of autonomy, loss of dignity, and fear of being a burden, and a culture that encourages and helps disabled citizens through their struggles, those two are juxtaposed. So, the second part of my argument for PAS, and I'll kind of wrap it or try to speed it up here, is that PAS is a substantive right to personal autonomy and end-of-life decisions, which the state does not have the right to prohibit. My two parts to argue against this is that this is not necessarily the case, and I'll kind of get into it and explain that further, that it's a substantive due process right, and two, that legalizing PAS does not actually promote autonomous decision-making. So, the PAS people actually, I think, I understand where they're coming from when they say they have a substantive process due right, because they're drawing from Planned Parenthood v. Casey, in which they established or formulated this right a little bit. And in that case, it was stated that substantive due process rights have to be a matter, quote, involving the most intimate and personal choices a person may make in a lifetime. It's obviously very subjective. Personal autonomy was described as, quote, the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. So, I mean, if I had a poly-like viewpoint, I would think that I had a substantive process to PAS because it's a meaningful decision to me. It's part of how I define my life. However, in Washington v. Glucksberg, one of the seminal cases in PAS jurisprudence in America, the court looked to clarify this, saying, quote, although Casey recognized that many of the rights and liberties protected by the Due Process Clause sound in personal autonomy, it does not follow that any and all important, intimate, and personal decisions are so protected. So this is the argument against it being a substantive due process right. This is going to be further supported by my second point in that it's not actually supporting or promoting autonomous decision-making at the end of life. So if those two things are true, then there's no reason that it should be allowed because there are many dangers that come along with it. So my second rebuttal is that it doesn't actually contribute to personal autonomy in end-of-life decisions. This is because of the high risk that comes along with it, just naturally. The high risk of people choosing it out of depression, in their depression, and the high risk of coercion. And that's not just because the safeguards are very lacking in our current legal code for it, but also just because it's emotional manipulation and coercion from fear of being a burden. That would be a coercive factor. All of those contribute to make it really just a situation in which the risk is higher than the benefit for the few that are actually making it in an autonomous way. So just to reiterate that, kind of think of Helen from the intro to this thesis. They talked about her desire for death being like a locomotive, and how this was like a sign of her autonomy. In reality, quote, rigid tendencies to see only one possible solution, such as suicide, to problems are signs of depressive disorders. So what we have here is one example of a tragic case of physician-assisted suicide, in which someone who should have gotten the standard of care necessary for someone who's considering suicide actually ended up just getting help in committing suicide. Secondly, okay, just to back up here, this is to show that this is a serious problem. 70%, it's been shown that 70% of cancer patients can suffer from depression. In Oregon, in 2018, 62% of the people requesting it had cancer. 1.8% were referred for psychological evaluation. So clearly those numbers don't add up. Clearly there are a number of people with depression who are receiving PAS. And I read an article last night about someone who had muscular dystrophy or something along those lines, who had been qualified for PAS since he was 18, and he said, I don't understand why I don't have the same preventative measures for suicide as everyone else. Like, I can get depressed. I don't actually want to commit suicide, but there are moments when you have that desire, and I wish that there was something to protect me from that and not facilitate it. So I thought that was a very poignant point to make. And just, again, to the second part of that would be actually just direct coercion. That's another serious problem from either being a fear of being a burden, that's a non-autonomous factor in a decision making, but also direct coercion from family members and limited insurance coverage. I'm running out of time here, but from family members, they can easily navigate weak safeguards. There's no limits about an heir being a co-signer to PAS, which is very clearly a conflict of interest. And no one has to be there to make sure that they're self-administering. So clearly those are all serious, just public policy problems. So given all of this, that there are inherent dangers in the quality of life outlook that put life at risk, and given that we don't want to accept suicide as an answer, and given that PAS is a substantive right, it's not actually well rooted in our jurisprudence, and that it does not promote autonomy but actually increases the risk of abuse and mistakes. Given all this, I make my argument and conclude that legalizing PAS and codifying the quality of life perspective in law is not, or it is within the state's interest, compelling interest, to prohibit this. So that's my thesis. Thank you again all for coming, and I'll take questions.
Interesting reasons that were given by people who decided that they wanted PAS or were considering it. One was loss of autonomy, the other was concern about being a burden. What's the difference between these two? They seem like flip sides of the same coin. And the other question that I have is this really about autonomy at all? Might it really be more about quality of life? Given that PAS is just one of the cases in which we will end human life, the other being refusal to receive needed medical treatment, oftentimes with incompetence, we impute to them that it is their choice, even though obviously they can't, because we've made a decision as a society that they don't have lives worth living.
Yeah, so I guess to the first one, I would say there's a difference between those two, only in how the individual themselves feels per se. So I kind of got the feeling reading it that a lot more people were doing it out of fear of being a burden than they would say because they knew it looked bad, for example. But like loss of autonomy, I mean, if you're wealthy and you can afford private care, and therefore you're not really being a burden, I think loss of autonomy can still be a serious reason, just because you hold a quality of life view and you think that your life's not worth living anymore, as you alluded to in your next part. And I absolutely do think that it really is more about quality of life, because if it was about autonomy, we wouldn't have all of these serious holes in our, like the legalization of this. I read one case in which a patient was referred to a psychiatrist who said, I believe it was a psychiatrist who said she's being coerced by her daughter, but he approved her anyways because her quality of life was bad. So it clearly, like, the people who are actually in favor of this, that's kind of like, I don't know if I said this explicitly, but I really see the autonomy part of it as just like a justification for the broader American audience, to kind of justify to them, like, this is okay, everybody, for those who aren't comfortable with quality of life view. But for those who actually are promoting it, it really is about quality of life, and that it's this like mercy killing perspective and approach and intention, which obviously I think most Americans actually do have a problem with. I think it's succeeded because they've used the autonomy part in the argument, but in reality most of the time it's very quality of life based.
Any other thoughts?
Is quality of life something that's commonly used in law as a reason behind the decision that's made, or is Planned Parenthood versus Casey the first set the precedent for quality of life decisions?
So Planned Parenthood v. Casey was primarily important in its formulation, at least in regards to my thesis, in its formulation of substantive due process, which is a little different than quality of life. So substantive due process would be a woman's right to privacy, for example. It's fundamental to what's the phrase? To ordered liberty or something like that, in which they can have an abortion. So they don't recognize the fetus as a child. There's no life at stake. It's part of her own autonomy, substantive due right. The quality of life view is kind of more like foundational in that it is a philosophy that many people have. It's kind of a natural result of viewing the world in like a material way, which shows why it's become more popular since like modernity and everything. It does have it is also rooted in like jurisprudence in the United States. So you have like the quality of life issues, that's how they're referred to in con law, if I'm remembering correctly. There are other quality of life issues, like Dr. Suter mentioned, like whether euthanasia would be legalized, or whether you can refuse treatment, whether you can take someone off of food and water who's non-competent. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Terry Schiavo case. That's another quality of life issue. So all these things would follow under the jurisprudence of like the quality of life issues, I guess. Anybody else?
I'll ask another one. In terms of the arguments against quality of life, is there more to it than simply having vulnerable groups? I guess one of the concerns that exists with quality of life is simply that it doesn't stipulate what characteristics one must have in order to have quality of life, and so it's somewhat arbitrary in that whoever is in power is the one who gets to define what is quality. Just thoughts about that in terms of.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, like I mentioned, the inherent dangers of it, I mean, those are serious reasons, and I did formulate my thesis at the end, including given a quality of life outlook. Even if I actually held a quality of life outlook, I don't think, or I hope I wouldn't support PAS because of the risks, but as one of the reasons why I don't hold a quality of life outlook, besides those inherent dangers, I think there's just, yeah, I mean, given this slippery slope, I think that comes from the fact that any philosophy that doesn't have a bright line to protect human life is dangerous. And so I was thinking, I talked about sanctity of life in the Christian view, but I'd argue that like Kantianism also holds like a type of sanctity of life view in which, you know, the person is not a means to an end. And I think that that's just, you know, if Kant is anything, he's consistent. And I appreciate that consistentness in that there's not a lot of danger like there are in the quality of life issues.